At this point, I cannot keep up with Michael's release of these raw cut reactions on Bellular clips. There's something I've struggled with my own emotions too because I'm invested in both games and I play them differently than him. I've always respected his opinion, but when you have a chance to sit down and think about something before you talk, which I don't in reaction content and his raw clips don't do as opposed to his scripted content, sometimes like my feelings towards the content may come across as frustrated or really praising or whatever. Either way, I do want to stop and just say thank you to him covering the game so thoroughly, and really giving it an honest shot. Even if he doesn't stick with it, that's okay. I'm at this point now watching them out of order. I know there's some in here that I want to go watch offline, and this is an example of why when he talks about how frustrating it is that you have to make thumbnails and titles the way you do, when he puts out this much content, I can't consume it all, and so I'm forced to choose based on thumbnails and titles, and so I absolutely get that. We regularly get criticized for clickbait as well, and so when he talks about that subject, I appreciate it. And today we're going to be talking about rating in Final Fantasy XIV compared to WoW.
So I suppose let's do your thoughts on raids.
Yep. So, right.
I don't know how far into the game Michael is at this point, especially now that I'm watching them out of order.
This is going to be I guess I'll start with where I've done so far. Or actually, I'll start with what I haven't done, in fact. So, in terms of raids, I've not done Alexander, I've not done Omega, I've not done the Void Ark line, and I've not done Return to Ivalice. Those are...
I know what these things mean.
I know from your confusion. Basically, I've done nothing raid-wise in Heaven's Road or Stormblood.
Right, so you've only done Shadowbringers raid content.
So I've done the Binding Coils of Bahamut. Not the Unending Coil, the one I've done the Binding Coils, the original 2.0 raids.
Yeah.
2.0 up to 2.5 raids. And I've done the Crystal Tower, which is the Alliance raids, the 24-man ones in 2.0, which you need to do for story quest, for story.
For context, I'm missing some too. It has a lot more to do with how busy I was in the time that they were released, and the fact that I've never made time to go back. And so if I was at a time where I was getting very little game time, then raids got skipped. And if I was at a time where I got to play a lot of games, then raids got cleared. I have ignored Savage intentionally for the vast majority of my time in 14. I have dabbled in extremes. I have never set foot inside of an ultimate.
Content now anyway. They should make the Binding Coils of Bahamut actually required, but I'll explain that in a little bit. And I've done... have I done everything in Shadowbringers? I've done everything in Shadowbringers, just not on Extreme or Savage. But I've done all the normal difficulty stuff as of the night before. As of the night before, where I did Diamond Weapon. So I've done all of that stuff on normal.
So what are, just to explain, what are the difficulty levels of a raid in this game?
So there are 3 types of raid. There are trials, which are usually against single bosses in very, very big story moments. And usually like singular in sort of nature, so it's a trial. Is just this, here's a boss, whatever. There's raids, which is usually you still do them one boss at a time, as like for example E1, E2, E3.
So you wouldn't queue up for, I assume E means Eden.
Yeah. Right.
So you wouldn't queue up for.
So I'm going to start at this a little differently. He may come back and do it this way. I'm going to describe our raids entirely in WoW terminology. So effectively, what we have is what would be the large story moments, maybe reserved for the end of a dungeon or the end of a raid series, that are queued off into their own standalone thing. Much like you might go fight a world boss or something like that, you're going to queue in as 8-man. These are our trials. They are usually heavily narrative based if they are standalone things, or they are in a standalone trial series that takes us through a meaningful story that ties back to, but is not necessarily... So this particular expansion, we got Sorrows of Werlit for the vast majority of our big chunk of our trials, but then we also got some of these key story moments. And so there isn't anything quite like trials. But for WoW terminology alone, let's group trials and raids together because they both really are trash free at this point. The way you queue into fights is we go in with 8 people, always 8. There is no scaling size. It's always 8. 2 tanks, 2 healers. The rest are DPS, preferably 2 melee and 2 ranged. And we actually go in and we queue directly in, much like you would queue in into LFR, but we do that for all difficulties. You go straight to the boss you want. Now, the first time through, you have to clear them in order, but after that, like, if you just want to jump to that, and so we've come up with a numbering and a naming convention that he's about to do, much like people give bosses individual names. But because they're all numbered and they're in order, we were forced to do a naming convention. So the first initial that he's mentioning is the name of the raid series. This expansion is Eden, and so that's E, but we've had others. And then we get 4 bosses at a time instead of the traditional, let's say, 10 of World of Warcraft. And so we only get 12 across an expansion. So our raid series is 1 through 12. So if you numbered bosses in WoW, it would get very confusing because you would have N for Nathria, and then you would have N 1 through 10, and then you would have to get a new initial for the next raid, because otherwise we would be counting up to like 30 or something silly. So it's just different. And then as far as difficulties go, World of Warcraft uses LFR, which is story mode, which in Final Fantasy XIV, if you fail a single-player scenario, it'll offer you to lower that down. It's very similar to that, but for raiding. And then they have normal mode, where mechanics have to be respected, but if you're aware that you have buttons on the bar and the mechanics are a thing that exists, you're probably going to get the clear. If you talk about heroic, that's where all of a sudden you need to know your class, you need to know mechanics. But if you already knew that for normal, it may not feel like a massive jump. And then there's mythic, which is meant to grind your face into the ground. So the top end players make it look really easy and clearable week 1. That is not the typical progression for people going into mythic. Many guilds are full heroic by the end of a tier with a partial mythic clear. It's very, very hard. In Final Fantasy, I assume he's about to dress on this, Extreme and Savage get really close together, in my opinion. We don't have an LFR difficulty, so we have to make normal a little bit easier than normal because it has to be clearable by everybody, which means the moment you jump up to any version of heroic or mythic, the gap gets enormous for players that have never jumped across it before.
For Eden, and then be in an Eden run doing all of it, you would queue up for a specific Eden boss?
Yes.
Okay, and then when your queue pops, you teleport in to, like, what, just before that boss?
You can actually queue for multiple if you want, so if I need to clear 9, 10, 11, and 12 this week, I can toss myself into all of them, and then whatever pops first, then next time I'll queue for the remaining 3 and work my way down. I don't have to run them in order.
You teleport into that boss arena.
Okay, and is there trash between these bosses?
No. Not in normal raids, as they're called. Just raids, there's no trash.
Wow.
It's literally queue in, fight the boss, out you go.
Now, there was trash back in the day, so new players that are trying to re-clear old raids, that's a shift. Raids have gone closer and closer to what trials are.
It's really, really, like, it's really heavy instance sort of feeling in a way, but it vibes with general gameplay a little bit more.
Gotcha.
As far as I can turn, as I feel anyway, currently playing it, I've not really felt much of the downsides. And then there's Alliance raids. Oh, those are 8-man, by the way.
Yeah, so we've...
It doesn't mean there aren't ad phases inside of bosses. So it doesn't mean you're always just single targeting. It just means that there's not literal trash. Things that you clear, take a rest, whatever you want to do. Things where like half your party's AFK getting a drink or whatever. It means that everything is locked inside the encounter.
We've got
Trials and
our
normal raids are
trials and
8-man.
normals, which are 8-man.
Yeah, single bosses.
And yeah, so a trial is basically like a one-shot thing, like say Onyxia, like a one-shot boss raid.
Yes.
I don't mean one-shot as in clear,
Perfect
just
example.
one boss to kill. So that's what
That's a perfect example. Onyxia, Magtheridon, even Gruul. Well, no, Gruul has a couple of layers. Yeah. Yes.
a trial is, and then a raid, just called a raid, is
a raid.
just like 8-man. But the core difference between WoW is you don't have trash.
Yeah,
And
it's not
can-
like a big instance or anything. It's just you zone in, fight the boss, done.
You zone in, you fight the boss, and in terms of difficulty levels, while it is something you can queue for, it is more analogous to normal mode difficulty in WoW than LFR difficulty.
So
Another key difference is that because it's individual things, they're individual lockouts. And so if you had a group that wanted to clear 9 and 10 and then had to call it a night, you could go, if you know that your raid group is not going to attempt 11, if you wanted to, you could go join another group for 11 prog because you haven't triggered your weekly lockout on that specific boss. That gets a little more convoluted in WoW. And so, but like the weekly lockout thing still applies. As a matter of fact, top end raid groups in both games do something called splits. And so, and the amount of emphasis on splits has more to do with time and the benefit than actually whether or not it's good for the game or is enjoyable as a player. What a split is it's taking advantage of loot encounters so that you can funnel loot to players to gear them up faster. It doesn't actually drop more loot per hour played. It increases their hour played and allows loot to scale with it. The way World of Warcraft does it is they actually push all of an armor type into a raid so that that armor type drops, so that if anybody gets something, it can kind of be traded around. So the way it's worked historically is you would kind of run like you'd have a druid tank so that it's in leather. You'd have all your leather wearers, right? When you're warrior tanking or paladin tanking, you'd have a lot of paladin healers, so you're stacking plate. So you'd stack a ton of these types into things that are easy to clear, and then you would run it as many times as needed, and you would funnel the loot to the main characters inside that raid first, and then let it trickle down from there. In the way that would work in 14, because we work on more of a token type system than World of Warcraft, is we really, the most splits I've seen personally is I've seen people doing 2. So they'll do 4 mains and 4 alts and then flip. And that allows them to funnel all the loots to the mains. Splits is something that allows hardcore endgame raiders to pull way ahead of the standard population, and as a result, usually the devs have put the pacing in so that a raid lasts a full patch cycle. So seeing somebody separate out from everybody else, making casual players feel bad, and allowing the endgame players to get to burnout faster, is usually something that devs frown upon. I don't really see how they avoid it, but remember in 14 that to do a split, the difference is you would have to have another character fully cleared of story on the class that you're going to be needed as. And so if you are slotted as a healer on your alt, you need an alt with that class. So you may have leveled all of them on your main. You're going to have to do that all over again, or boost it. And so it gets a little messier than in World of Warcraft, where like you have alts anyway, so it's just a question of are they geared enough to do it.
So the general difficulty progression is trials, raids, alliance raids, extreme trials, and savage raids.
Okay, so
Extreme and savage being difficulties of trials and raids.
Okay, so
keep me right if I'm
so
I'm
trials
wrong here.
and raids
Yeah.
are on normal, savage, and extreme difficulty.
No, trials are normal and extreme. Raids
Extreme.
are normal and savage.
Okay, so it
Every piece of content in the game is just is normal. We don't clarify normal because we don't have an LFR. If the content is just stated, I would like to run X, then it is assumed to be normal. Everything after that is added. So our ultimates have unique names. Hard modes of dungeons don't mean anything. That just determines a level jump because the dungeon is reused. And so you see extreme listed for trials and an S. So you'd see E9 means the 9th boss of Eden on normal. E9S means the savage version of that fight.
they're just called savage and extreme for really no particular.
Well, yeah, that's just what they're called. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that's
That's a translation issue right there, because like hard mode of dungeon is something that implies something different in English than I think they intended. We now have added another difficulty called Unreal, and that is where we take an old piece of content and we scale it up, because the scaling system works so different in Final Fantasy than World of Warcraft.
definitely they have a lot of names for things, and that can be overwhelming in this
and
game.
the closest thing to, well, I see people talking about the well, there's also Ultimate, which is the hardest difficulty stuff that's completely like purely bragging rights in a sense. And I don't know if, because there's like I've not done any of them. I think there's only 3 of them in existence at the minute, which is, you know,
Okay.
there's not very many, but they're pretty rare, and they're completely nuts. They're their own raid. They're not like a hard difficulty. They're very, very interesting.
That's the ultimate.
Yeah, Ultimate, yeah.
Okay.
We've only gotten 3 ultimates ever. The 4th one comes early next expansion, so probably early 2022 if I had to guess. First half of 2022. I would hope 6.1. The ultimates are mostly community centric as far as like the world first. For the average player, they're mostly going to interact with it by watching it. It is not attempted by the vast majority of the player base. The easiest way to translate ultimate for a WoW player is imagine in a particular expansion or in a particular tier, if you only took the hardest 2 or 3 bosses at Mythic and you combined them. And then you only locked cosmetics behind it. So you only locked really cool weapons behind it that you could transmog. So it is there to punish you into the ground. And then what makes Ultimate unique is that you can't just go back. Like I went back and got Ashes of Alar once I could just solo the raid by myself. Because then I could clear it every single week in a matter of minutes outside of the big dialogue talking at the end, because I was trying to get all the things from the expansion, or from that. So I was clearing all the bosses, and Sunwell has some mess in it. But here, like, that doesn't scale. You're always going to be basically fighting it at that original difficulty as close as they can preserve. So you're always going to scale down to that level and have abilities and gear appropriate for that level. Now, of course, as we add new classes to the game, as we adjust stats, as we prune abilities and add abilities that may affect what was available in that level range currently, it does get screwed with. We're going through our first stat squish in Endwalker, so that, of course, might screw with it slightly. But their goal is to preserve ultimates. And so clearing an ultimate at any point, the vast majority of the player base is going to just respect that as a clean and significant clear, an amazing achievement. It doesn't really matter when you cleared it. You cleared it back then, you cleared it a year ago, you cleared it yesterday. All of those are something that gets a lot of respect in the community because there isn't an easy way to do it.
So that's like the Unending Coil of Bahamut.
Is an ultimate.
Is an ultimate, yeah. It's not another difficulty boss, it's a completely different
Right,
boss.
so you've got trials, you've got raids, and then ultimates are like, they resemble trials and raids, but they're their own
Yes.
unique type of content that's just
Yes.
super, super hard shit.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then
Is there anything beyond Savage?
well,
Or Extreme?
Ultimate is Beyond Savage, that's it.
Okay, but not within the same. So
No.
you can't do an Ultimate Eden.
No.
Okay.
No, there's no Ultimate Eden.
Okay, so that actually seems quite.
Yeah, ultimates are not in sequence. So, like, when they add another ultimate, they're pulling an old raid out of the hat. So imagine if mid-Shadowlands, they released an ultimate that tied together bosses from Wrath of the Lich King or from Legion. Like, they could just go pull bosses from those. And that's why the naming convention form is so unique. First of all, we only have 3, so we don't need to make super unique naming conventions for it. And so, like, the Epic of Alexander. And so you end up with these other names. They are really pretty standalone fights. They require a huge amount of dev resources, and they have looked into, with the current thing, because they require so much in-house testing, they have looked into ways to try to streamline that. They have yet to find one. Delivering 2 per expansion was the goal last expansion, and they missed that mark because of COVID. So we don't get very many of them.
Quite simple then. There's only 2 difficulty modes per type of content, unless it's an ultimate, in which case it's only an ultimate.
Then there's Alliance raids, which have 1 level difficulty only, which are more akin to regular WoW raids, but a bit smaller. They're the 24-man ones that consist of 3 8-man groups.
Right.
And they are a little bit more, you're in here for a while, not a long time. It's like 45 minutes. You're killing between, I think it's between 3 and 6 bosses, because it varies depending on what expansion or whatnot.
And how much trash is there in an Alliance raid?
Minimal.
Okay.
So Alliance raids it'll number the trash. It numbers it for you, and some of the things feel like trash to me, and so they count as encounters. So it's these series of encounters. They don't have harder versions. I can't. Most equivalent to Alliance raids is they really feel different to me as far as like how tied into story they are, or how on theme they are. As somebody that's not like maybe as invested in the story as these guys likely will be. Alliance raids have always felt out of place, especially this expansion when they were a crossover event where they were near themed, another game put out by Square Enix. So Alliance raids are probably closest to like when we put out imagine if you had LFR groups put through normal difficulty, and then think about like the raids in Wrath of the Lich King when we had like PvP raids. Like, they don't necessarily follow the same rules. They have a lot of mechanics that trials and raids don't do. They're there kind of just to screw with you. Day 1, they're chaos. People are dying everywhere. Still today, they die. So Alliance raids are a bit of shenanigans. I would love to see them add harder versions tied to the Relic, our optional legendary. This expansion, we also got 3 instance type raids that were clearable that were very similar to the Wrath of the Lich King PvP raids, and one of those did get a Savage that actually jumped it from being a 24-man normal to a 48-man Savage. And that is just shenanigans. Like, it's just chaos for chaos' sake. Those 3 raids didn't have to follow any of the normal instance rules. They have all sorts of weird and fun mechanics. So when people watch me on Tuesdays and I'm spending time in the relic-based instances and near raids, they're like, is this what the game is like? No.
Like, there's some, but they're mini bosses more than trash.
So it's basically not really trash in this game.
There's almost no trash in this game.
That's crazy.
It's incredible for how...
I cannot think of a WoW raid night where I've been glad there's been trash.
Yeah.
And the developers have continually told me that I should be happy about the pacing that the trash gives me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But no, I enjoyed Trial of the Crusader. I didn't do Grand Crusader.
So what I think trash offers for me, what I think the developers used to do more with trash, is I think trash is a low-stakes way to introduce you to new mechanics. So if you have a boss that is going to drop bombs that have to be handled in a weird way, maybe you have let's say there's a piece of trash that carries a shield, and when you kill it, you get a buff that shields you from incoming damage for 10 seconds. And then another character, when you kill it, explodes. You could put that in trash, and then you would know to kill the shield guy, and then the bombs would go off. When the bombs go off, if you do it in the wrong order, it doesn't wipe the raid, it just nearly kills everybody, and it tells you that you did something wrong. Then in the boss, when the boss goes through a shield phase and a bomb phase, you have a better idea of how that mechanic works, especially because in WoW, they don't necessarily reuse mechanics from instance to instance to instance. One of the things that WoW veterans are likely to try to do, because this makes sense in WoW language, is to determine if Final Fantasy XIV is a good fit, they try to watch a current Shadowlands raid. Now, on one hand, watching an old raid doesn't make sense because you're watching what the devs were capable of on hardware and with knowledge that is years old. And so obviously the game has gotten better. On the other hand, by watching a raid from Shadowlands, there are mechanics that players are responding to very quickly and adeptly that you're like, well, how did they know to do that? And that is because that particular mechanic is not new. It has been iterated on and expanded on for many, many, many fights in a row now, and it has been laid in different ways. And that's why some people refer to 14 as more dance fighting, because it is this very reactive dance. Dance doesn't mean scripted, choreographed every time. Sometimes you don't know if you're going to go left or right, but it is going to have a telegraph. You recognize telegraphs, and you're going to immediately know left or right. There's not going to be as much learning what that mechanic does, because when you see a stack marker, you immediately recognize it. You're not going to wipe to it the first time you see it on each and every boss. You're going to wipe to it the first time you don't know what it does, and then every boss from there on out, you're going to know what a stack marker does.
Crusader. No, but I enjoyed Trial for that reason. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know. I think about Nyaloth and I think, ugh. But a lot of that was because of, trying to do trash when Cranny's also in your group. Sorry, Cranny. Hello.
Yeah, so it's...
I believe Cranny now is in Mr. GM's guild.
Is he? Interesting.
Or was he...
I don't know.
Was it at some point was he not Mr. GM's guild?
I forget. He was. I can't remember. But... yeah, so there's Ben Tyler with the super explaining. Difficulty tends to be normal trial, alliance raids, normal raids, Eureka/Baja raid,
48?
which is 48 man, and then extreme trials and savage raids.
That's the Baja front and Eureka, which are their own types of content with their own crap.
They literally break all kinds of rules. You can't see the people in other parties' health bars. You have all sorts of weird extra abilities or stats that are affecting you. The current one, you don't even balance groups, so you might be in a group that's all 6 tanks and 1 and 2 DPS, no healers, and they're just, the Eureka and Boja raids are shenanigans. So they are very fun, but they are, for people that have mastered the current battle system, they are a fun chance to take a break and have some fun with it. They are a place for the devs to play with some possible hypothetical changes taken to the extreme. And maybe they say, hey, I really liked that. What if we took a fraction of that and implemented it into the live system? They're siloed off into their own thing. They don't really show up in roulettes or anything like that, so you're not going to have these time walking equivalents where you're tossing players back into ones from years of old. They are intentionally separated and intentionally different.
Russian system.
Yes, other raids.
Right.
Yep. Which is nuts. Yeah, ARR and Heavensward did pre-fight mobs and the 8-mans. Modern ones don't. I didn't know that because I've not done the... the 8-mans in Realm Reborn? Yes, yeah. There's a slight amount of trash, but like
Okay.
now there's kind of like it's basically going mostly off the Eden and Nier stuff, because those are the most modern ones and what I expect going forward. And they are such beautiful experiences in terms of how they're paced.
Yeah.
Like the Tower of Paradigm's Breach, the final Nier raid, the Yorha Dark Apocalypse questline raid,
Wait, why did they call that the Nier raid?
because it's a crossover with Nier.
So it literally is a crossover with Nier.
Literally, like there are Nier automata
Wow.
characters and designs and enemies and everything.
And how
Now, keep in mind that Matt on the right, Nier is his favorite game of all time. Final Fantasy XIV is his second favorite game of all time. There is a huge portion of the 14 community that really does not like that our Alliance Raid series, the only 3 pieces of 24-man mainline content we got this expansion, was dedicated in its entirety to telling a crossover story with Nier, as opposed to next expansion, where there is that portion of the player population is thrilled that we are going to get just as fun of mechanics, just as fun of content, but that the story, the theming, the music, the bosses are going to be original 14 content around the theme myths of the realm.
do they make that like not break the world in the immersion?
Because it's sort of it's
Or is
like,
Because it does.
It's just basically fuck you, Nier's cool, we put it in our game, enjoy it.
it does slightly break the game in a very slight sense.
It does not slightly break the game. It massively breaks the game. People who like Nier or people who have used this to discover Nier can have a good time. So I'm not saying that has to be a bad thing, but it massively breaks the immersion.
But they also kind of have some mechanics that tie in, so you go, that's fine.
Okay.
Well,
I mean, hey, if
No. There are trains, there are flying skyscrapers, there are girls in red dresses. We are turned into little white and black ships at one point. There are robot goos merging into each other in a giant gumball of disgustingness. This is 100% immersion breaking. Even for somebody that may or may not care about lore, you are used to a certain style of bosses aesthetically. You're used to a certain style of music, even though Soken has a huge range. These are breaking. These are not standard. And it was very different last expansion when our crossover boss was a trial with Monster Hunter, and it was the Rathalos trial, and it was segmented off, as opposed to something that had quests we went and cleared out in a zone in the real world, and that this had 3 separate things supported through the 0.1, 0.3, and 0.5 patch. This is a massive piece of those patches. When we talk about fully loaded patches, the patches are only fully loaded if you like most of what's in them. So for people that were frustrated this was tied to Nier, it made 0.1, 0.3, and 0.5 all feel a little bit light.
it works, it works.
Yeah,
And I guess, I mean, you're a big
Yeah.
fan of Nier.
Also, it's canon and it's
Okay.
canon in Nier. It's canon.
right.
It's canon to the Nier
Which I'm sure everybody in Nier adores, that we made this canon.
universe and to FF14, so it's literally like
Boris
is-
here is saying, 2B leggings, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation.
So there's a joke in the character creator that it's frustrating that we don't have a butt slider to make our butts bigger, because we have other sliders in the game. And the 2B pants are the one thing that actually modifies your character's rear assets.
Mark.
yeah.
Yes, I feel like any 2B like costumes will do very well.
Well, yeah. I mean, the point is, in these raids, you get a crate that is full 2B costume. That-
Oh,
that
Yoko
meant-
Taro made it.
Yeah, he wrote it. Yeah.
Whoa.
And that's why
Right.
I have in one of my notes here. I have I'll remember that scene kneeling to talk to that dwarf for a long time. People know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's like, man, it's unbelievable.
The Monster Hunter one was also different because we sent a boss over to them that went into Monster Hunter. Because this was one directional and it was given so much space in the content cycle, this felt a lot closer to a billboard or an advertisement for Nier, as opposed to past crossovers such as Yokai Watch, where it was a side thing you could go interact with, kind of imagine like a pet battle event where you got to go gather all these unique pets. Imagine if WoW collaborated with Pokemon and you could go get these Pokemon pets for this limited time, go out in the world and fight through these trainers, and you could get a Mewtwo minion or whatever. And then it went away and it came back 4 years later and you got to do it again. We've had these different crossovers. The Final Fantasy XV crossover. Go do a brief quest line about what it would be like if Final Fantasy 15 characters came into the world of 14, and then you get a mount from that game that plays music from that game. These crossover events have been these neat tributes, these neat awarenesses. WoW doesn't do anything directly like that, other than I think like they've done some little things like collaborations with Mountain Dew, and they do a ton of kind of NPCs named a certain thing. You know, the localization teams are already involved in pop culture references in quest names in both games. And so there's a lot of references to the world at large, kind of that looking at the camera type moment. The near raid is different. The near raid is, now you took those little minions from the Mountain Dew crossover and you said, hey, instead of Onyxia, we're now going to be fighting a Mountain Dew boss, and you're going to get game fuel drop that is a best in slot. And like, that's what it would feel like as a WoW player. Now keep in mind, the near raids are only on normal difficulty, so they didn't actually affect end-game gear progression, but that's the level of impact that it feels like they had. And so for people that loved it, it has been amazing, world-shattering. And for people that haven't, they said, hey, just so you guys know, we're not doing it again. And there is a portion of the 14 audience that cheered.
There's a super here from Hi from Buddha who says ultimates are an homage, or like an homage, to past content. They're a reimagining of past fights meant to be a continuous 20-minute gauntlet.
Yep.
So ultimates are like so even though the thingy of Bahamut or whatever, and Bahamut from what I understand is like the big dragon who came from the moon, who is narrative content in A Realm Reborn.
Yeah.
And I assume he's dealt with after that.
It's the...
Or something, but is that a thing that happened in A Realm Reborn, but then Ultimate,
I believe,
Chains of Bahamut came in like later?
I believe it came in Heavensward, and it's kind of... I don't
expansion
actually...
1?
Yeah. I don't actually know what the... I don't know what the narrative framing for that is, but this is the fun thing. The extremes and the extremes and the savages aren't actually canonical content.
What?
This is weird. At least this is for the ones that I've seen so far. The higher difficulty versions are Recollections. Oh, Stormblood, sorry. I thought it was Heavensward. Stormblood.
I believe the bard is supposed to be Yoshi P in the game, is my understanding. And our extremes and savages are the telling of a tale. Toss a coin to your Witcher. They are these, typically, the way we're tying them in lore-wise, is that they're a taller tale version. But keep in mind that with Savage, it's the last boss of every tier of Savage gets an extra phase that does give us a cutscene that impacts story. And so watching the world first race to reveal that cutscene, especially for players that never plan on clearing that content, it is the only way to get to that. But I believe that bard, that minstrel, is supposed to be a reference to Yoshi P in some cases.
But yeah, that stuff's not canonical. It's Recollections, which is funny. It's like one of the things is the minstrel's ballad, as they say. So you, after doing this raid, you go speak to a minstrel, and he sings a song about that raid, but embellishes details.
Oh, so the additional difficulty is the embellished details from the minstrel.
Yep.
Is that how they explain it being video game bullshit?
Yep.
Like, to give you the difficulty, it's just the minstrel trying to make you seem like more of a...
Yes, and the fact that we can see mechanics on the ground is this thing that we have that's called the Echo, and that's what allows us... it's also what justifies that we can speak all languages. So, like, these are just loose parts of the story that justify the fact that this is still a video game.
Badass.
Yeah, you basically play fanfics. That's what someone just said.
We've got the Killer Stove here just supering us, saying the Nier universe canonically has timeline hopping and dimension hopping, which makes crossovers incredibly easy.
Yeah, I mean, cool. I mean,
keep in mind that we often talk about the way in-game content has to be respectful of story to tell a good story. And so in Final Fantasy, because the mechanical battle content is so respectful of story, people assume that means you have to do the story. But it cuts the other way. There are times that the mechanical team says, we have to show boss mechanics, or we've got to have harder difficulties, or we've got to have somebody that lives through something or whatever, or we've got to have something that this fight responds in this way. The narrative team has to sometimes justify those. So there are moments where the lore says something took place, because mechanically when you talk about the game, you're like, well, it did have to take place. It's what's so interesting about the Shadowlands, right? The Shadowlands is where you go when you die. And our character, being this Mawwalker, this ability, our character has had a weird relationship with death in World of Warcraft because you die and walk back to your corpse. And so you've been seeing this kind of arbiter or whatever for years, not really understanding it. And so it's a beautiful and poetic lore explanation that has been long in the making and long anticipated and was supposed to be an earlier expansion in the game that explains something that mechanically has to happen in any game that's not going to delete your character because you die in combat.
In the entire
Need to
Nier,
play Automata.
the entire Nier series is based off a alternate ending to Drakengard 1, where the disease from Drakengard somehow, I don't know how, because I've not seen the ending, makes its way to modern day Tokyo.
Oh, that's really cool. I guess Replicant will dive into that. If that's the...
Yeah, that's the main story of Nier.
I think regarding maybe
Yep.
Ultimates here, Keg Gaming dropped a super saying, imagine fighting Lich King, Syndragosa, Blood Queen, Lanathel, and Sarfang back to back at the same time while Uther doesn't help.
Yeah.
Wait, Uther? Well, it says
Probably
Luther
means
there,
Tyrion, I
but
imagine.
probably means Tyrion, yeah.
Yeah.
So is an Ultimate going to be like, hey, what if you had to fully defeat the Lich King and there was no ice cube breaking Chad?
Yeah.
And then that would be the Ultimate. So it's like not canonical, but it's okay. Gotcha. Thanks
Yeah.
for the super, by the way.
Yep.
That's a handy.
Mhm.
It's handy when things are explained in terms of WoW because it's just we know that, so it's easy to
Yeah.
understand.
Ultimates are, if time walking was not meant to be something casual to do on the side, if time walking was meant to be like a challenge dungeon that went back and reinvented and said, hey, with everything we know about raid design today, we think it'd be really fun to go back and pair the Lich King fight with Yogg-Saron. Those were already two really epic fights as far as the community's memory goes, and so it's a chance to relive those back to back in a meaningful way. So it can create these really unique moments. So Ultimate is a lot more fan service than really a tribute to the lore, in my opinion. I think when the one thing they didn't get to here is that when raiders are primarily raiders in a game, story is something maybe they enjoy, maybe it enhances their game experience, maybe they ignore it. Side content is something they do to pass the time while their raid group is getting online or something like that. Crafting is a necessary evil that they maybe find joy in that helps them repair or craft their own gear for raiding or whatever. But raiding is the pinnacle of what they consider an MMORPG experience. Those people exist in both games. When World of Warcraft raiders look at coming over, one of the things they can be frustrated at is that there's 10 bosses per tier versus 4. We had a WoW player come over by the name of Scott Zone who leveraged this very fair complaint to the 14 community and got a ton of backlash. I think the answer to that, especially for new players or players who maybe came in late to the game that came over from WoW and are wondering where the raid content is, especially during the 5.5 patch cycle right now until Endwalker, where because the ultimate from this expansion got kicked out to 6.1, they might feel that they had anticipated having a big fight to progress through, and they just don't. One of the things I would point out is that this game does allow you to go back and sync content down to previous difficulties. So you can sync down to best in slot of the time. That's just called syncing. You get limited to the abilities on the bar. That's how we do the vast majority of our time. And you get synced to an appropriate gear level, and you have the abilities that were appropriate on the bar. That allows the content to feel that way, but the syncing system is very, very generous. So it just lets you taste the content. It is easier than it was. But we also have a button in the optional settings menu where you can choose to do something minimum item level. And this gets a whole lot more respectful. And there are mechanics that cannot be ignored and cannot be skipped. And so blind prog on every dungeon, every trial, every raid, every extreme, every savage with minimum item level would be an epic undertaking. You're talking about hundreds of instances, at least single digit hundred. I have no idea, hundreds of bosses. I have no idea what the total amount of content there is. And so if you were to start at the easy stuff, Sestasha, minimum item level, just to get a feel for what it does. Wow, I have no buttons on my bar. And you were to progress your way all the way through up, doing all the trials, all the raids as they unlocked. Even if you just started at level 50 to ignore leveling content, there are some moments that would be very, very difficult. There are some dungeons that would prove tricky. There are some trials that would prove tricky. There are some raids, extremes and savages, that would be very, very hard. And so if you're looking for that mountain of content, yes, eventually you would keep up, but when you talk about playing a game for 5 or 10 years and then maybe taking a break to play a different one, that is what I would say is the optional backward content that I wish the game did a better job of promoting and rewarding, because you wouldn't get any unique achievements or glamour. You would simply be doing it to do it. But because it's easy to stay up with gear progression in this game, there really isn't an unlimited use for gil, so you don't have this needless, like endless need for gold like you do in WoW. If you're just looking for something to do, because it is pretty easy to stay caught up, and everything after that's optional, this would be a way of adding optional raid content that you would progress through, and just so that you could check it off in a spreadsheet to say you did that. And so that's the one thing here that I think could have maybe helped stem some of the conversation, because when it comes to quantity, WoW wins by far. Between Mythic Plus and the number of raid bosses per tier, the sheer quantity makes it to where, like, when you're really pairing, WoW gets to pick and choose their fighters, right? They get to say, well, compared to that raid, I'm going to pick these 1 or 2 bosses. And compared to that raid, I'm going to pick these 1 or 2 bosses. They've got a whole stable of things to choose from. So if a particular boss is undertuned or is boring or is buggy, they can actually throw that out, because 14 doesn't put forward enough content per tier that they can hold them to that. Because it's 10 bosses to 4. And so even if you subtract out the 2 or 3 or 4 worst bosses of Nathria, you still have more bosses per tier. That's helped a little bit by the fact that we only have Nathria so far for Shadowlands. But even in that time, even in that extended patch cycle that World of Warcraft is in currently, Final Fantasy still only puts out 4 at a time and 1 trial. Like, it just isn't as much. And so I would say look back on the content. And that's how I would make the games hold up, because World of Warcraft doesn't really have an easy way to make past content relevant, and that's an advantage when talking about rating in Final Fantasy XIV compared to WoW, which was really the point of this whole conversation, kinda.